Clive Randall had always been a man who valued order and control. As a former financial analyst, he thrived on precision and clarity, both in his career and in his personal life. After years of navigating the chaotic corporate world, he decided to leave it behind, purchasing a modest but well-maintained house on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The property came with a sizable plot of land, a portion of which bordered the main road. While others might have ignored this strip of dirt and weeds, Clive saw potential. Over the years, he transformed it into a tidy garden with flowering shrubs, a small bench, and a meticulously trimmed hedge that marked the boundary between his land and the public sidewalk. For Clive, this strip wasn't just land, it was a statement of ownership and pride, a reflection of his ability to bring order to anything he touched. Life in the neighborhood had been uneventful, which was exactly how Clive liked it. The occasional neighborhood association notices about lawn maintenance or community events were easy to ignore, as they rarely affected him directly. He wasn't the type to attend barbecues or block parties. His focus was his home, his sanctuary. Every weekend, Clive would put on his gardening gloves, pick up his shears, and tend to his plants. The soft rustle of leaves, the faint smell of fresh earth, and the satisfaction of a cleanly pruned hedge gave him a sense of peace he hadn't found in the corporate world. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clive returned home from a brief trip to the hardware store to find something unusual. A large utility truck was parked near his property, its hazard lights flashing. Nearby, several men in reflective vests were unloading equipment, heavy machinery, steel poles, and what appeared to be electrical components. Clive parked his car in the driveway, puzzled by the scene. At first, he assumed it was routine road work. Perhaps they were repairing the sidewalk or working on underground cables, but as he approached, his confusion turned to irritation. The workers weren't on the sidewalk, they were on his property. "Excuse me," Clive called out, walking toward the group. One of the men glanced up briefly but returned to securing a piece of equipment. Clive raised his voice, more firmly this time. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" A younger man, likely in his late 20s, stepped forward. His name tag read Kevin, and his expression was a mixture of politeness and disinterest. "We're installing an EV charging station," Kevin said matter-of-factly, pointing to a set of blueprints pinned to a clipboard. "It's part of the local infrastructure upgrade initiative." Clive frowned, glancing at the blueprints, which were spread out on the hood of the truck. Sure enough, they depicted a charging station, complete with multiple outlets and a small kiosk for payment. But what caught his attention was the label on the plan: installation site public access. The area marked as the installation site wasn't public at all. It was his land. "There's a mistake," Clive said, his voice tightening. "This isn't public property. This is my land." Kevin raised an eyebrow but didn't seem particularly concerned. "You'll need to take that up with the city," he said, stepping back toward his crew. "We're just following the work order." Clive's jaw tightened as he watched the crew begin their work, drilling into the ground he had carefully landscaped. He tried to explain further, but Kevin was already walking away, waving dismissively. Frustrated but determined, Clive headed back into his house to retrieve the property deed. He knew every square inch of his land was legally his, and he wasn't about to let anyone city-approved or not override that. By the time Clive returned, clutching the documents, the workers had already erected the first steel pole and were preparing to install the charging outlets. "Stop," he demanded, holding up the papers. "This proves that this land belongs to me. You can't just dig it up without my permission." Kevin barely glanced at the papers before shrugging. "We're just contractors. If you have an issue, you'll need to file a complaint with the city. We have a permit for this." Clive scanned the permit Kevin held out briefly. The words blurred in his growing anger. He noted the official stamps and signatures but couldn't fathom how this could have been approved without his knowledge. "You can't just invade someone's property because of a permit. It's illegal," Clive snapped. But the crew continued, ignoring his protests. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the charging station began to take shape, a gleaming beacon of modern infrastructure planted squarely in Clive's garden. The workers packed up their tools and left without a word, leaving Clive standing alone in the growing darkness, staring at the structure with a mix of disbelief and fury. The next morning, Clive woke to find an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a notice from the local utilities department, informing him that the charging station was now operational and connected to his home's electrical grid. The kicker? He was responsible for the electricity costs incurred by the station. The letter concluded with an almost cheerful reminder that this initiative was part of a green energy push to benefit the community. Clive's hands trembled as he read the notice. His meticulously organized life had just been upended. Not only had his land been taken without consent, but now he was expected to foot the bill for a public installation he neither wanted nor approved. He spent the rest of the day making calls to the city, to the utilities department, to anyone who might listen. But every response was the same: the installation was lawful, and any disputes would need to be resolved through official channels. By evening, Clive sat at his kitchen table, the notice and his property deed spread out in front of him. His once quiet life had been invaded by a faceless system that seemed impossible to fight. But as he stared at the gleaming charging station outside his window, one thing became clear: he wasn't going to let this go. The morning after Clive Randall received the notice about the charging station, he woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't a man who easily accepted defeat, and he certainly wasn't going to let a faceless bureaucracy bulldoze over his rights. After making himself a strong cup of coffee, he sat at the kitchen table and began crafting a plan of action. The first step was to go directly to the source, the city offices. If the notice claimed that the installation was lawful and permitted, then someone at the city had approved it, and Clive intended to find out who. By mid-morning, Clive was standing in line at the local municipal building. The air inside was stale, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead only added to the feeling of oppressive bureaucracy. Clive clutched his property deed tightly, his jaw set as he rehearsed what he would say. When his number was finally called, he stepped up to the counter, where a middle-aged woman with a tired expression greeted him. "I need to speak to someone about a recent installation on my property," Clive began, keeping his tone polite but firm. "A charging station was built on my land without my consent, and I've been billed for the electricity. This is a mistake, and I need it corrected immediately." The woman, whose name tag read Darlene, sighed and adjusted her glasses. "Do you have the property address and any documentation about the installation?" Clive slid the deed and the notice across the counter. "Everything you need is right here. The land is mine. The charging station shouldn't be there." Darlene typed something into her computer, her nails clicking on the keyboard. After a few moments, she frowned. "According to our records, that parcel of land is listed as part of the public right-of-way." "That's impossible," Clive snapped. "I've owned that land for years. It's clearly included in my deed." Darlene tilted her head and scanned the screen. "It looks like there was a reclassification of certain boundary lines in this area about a year ago. It was part of the city's infrastructure improvement plan. Notices were sent out to affected residents." "I didn't receive any notice," Clive said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "And even if I had, you can't just take private property and turn it into a public right-of-way without my approval." Darlene shrugged, her face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "If you believe there's been a mistake, you'll need to file a formal dispute with the zoning department. They're on the 3rd floor. But I'll warn you, these things take time." Clive stared at her, incredulous. "In the meantime, I'm supposed to just let this station sit on my land and pay for the electricity." "That's up to you," Sir Darlene said with a shrug. "I just processed the records." Fuming, Clive gathered his papers and headed to the 3rd floor. The zoning office was even more crowded than the front desk, with people sitting in mismatched chairs and clutching stacks of forms. After nearly an hour of waiting, he finally reached the front of the line, where he was handed a packet of forms to fill out. The clerk barely looked up as he explained his situation, only repeating the same mantra: "Submit the forms, and someone will get back to you in 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, Clive repeated, his voice rising. "This is my property. You can't expect me to wait months for a response while this thing sits there draining my electricity." "That's the process," the clerk replied flatly, already calling for the next person in line. Clive left the municipal building feeling no closer to a solution than when he had arrived. The system was designed to wear people down, to make them give up out of frustration. But Clive wasn't about to let that happen. As he drove home, his mind raced with possible next steps. He couldn't rely on the city to resolve this quickly, and in the meantime, the station was still racking up costs on his utility bill. When he got home, Clive called his attorney, a no-nonsense man named Richard Crane. Richard had helped Clive with a minor property dispute years ago and had proven himself to be both sharp and reliable. Clive explained the situation, laying out every detail he could remember. "Let me get this straight," Richard said, his voice measured. "The city claims they reclassified part of your land as public without notifying you, then installed a charging station, and now they're billing you for the electricity." "Exactly," Clive said. "And they're telling me I have to wait weeks, months, even to file a dispute." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That doesn't sound right. Even with reclassification, they'd need to provide notice and offer some form of compensation for taking private land. You said you didn't receive anything." "Not a single letter, email, or phone call," Clive replied. "And I check my mail religiously." "All right," Richard said. "First, we'll need to pull all the records related to this reclassification. There should be a paper trail. If they didn't notify you properly, that gives us leverage. Second, I'll look into the permit for the charging station. If it was issued under false pretenses, we might be able to get it revoked." "Good," Clive said, feeling a flicker of hope. "What should I do in the meantime?" "For now, document everything," Richard advised. "Take photos of the station, your property, and the installation site. Keep track of your utility bills, especially any increases. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case." Clive spent the rest of the day following Richard's advice. He photographed the charging station from every angle, carefully noting the damage it had caused to his garden. He dug through his files, searching for any letters or notices he might have missed, but found nothing. As the sun set, he sat down with his laptop to review his utility bills. The numbers made his stomach churn. His electricity costs had nearly tripled in the past week. Determined not to let the station drain him further, Clive decided to take action. Late that night, armed with a flashlight and a toolbox, he ventured out to the charging station. He inspected the connections, following the cables to where they linked into his home's power supply. It was a crude setup, hastily installed with little regard for safety or legality. Clive was tempted to disconnect it then and there, but Richard's words echoed in his mind. "Document everything" instead. He took more photos and made a detailed note of the setup. The next morning, Clive sent everything to Richard: the photos, the utility bills, the details of his visits to the city offices. He felt a surge of relief knowing that someone was finally taking his side. But even as he tried to focus on work, a gnawing sense of unease lingered. The charging station wasn't just an eyesore or a financial burden, it was a violation, a reminder that even in his carefully controlled world, chaos could still find a way in. That evening, Clive received an unexpected visitor. A man in a dark suit stood at his doorstep, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Randall?" the man asked, his voice smooth and professional. "Yes," Clive replied cautiously. "Who are you?" "I represent the company that installed the charging station," the man said, handing Clive a business card. The name on it read "Greengrid Solutions. I'd like to discuss a potential resolution to your concerns." Clive narrowed his eyes. "What kind of resolution?" "We understand this situation has caused you some inconvenience," the man said, his tone almost patronizing. "We'd like to offer you a financial incentive to allow the station to remain as is. It's a win-win for everyone." Clive's grip tightened on the card. "You're asking me to let you keep using my land without my consent." "It's not as simple as that," the man replied smoothly. "The station benefits the entire community. Think of it as your contribution to a greener future." Clive stared at him for a long moment, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Get off my property," he said finally, his voice cold and steady, "and tell your company I'm not interested." The man hesitated, his polished demeanor slipping for just a moment. "You might want to reconsider," he said, his tone carrying a faint edge. "This situation could get complicated." Clive didn't respond. He simply closed the door, the man's words echoing ominously in his mind. This wasn't just about a charging station anymore. It was a battle for control, and Clive was determined to win. Over the next few days, Clive Randall's sense of unease deepened. The man from Green Grid Solutions had left his words hanging in the air like a threat, and every glance out his window at the gleaming charging station in his garden felt like an insult. Clive was determined to fight back, but it seemed the deeper he dug into the situation, the more tangled it became. His attorney, Richard Crane, was making slow progress pulling the city's records, but bureaucracy moved at a glacial pace. Meanwhile, the electricity bills continued to rise and Clive's frustration simmered dangerously close to the surface. One morning, as he sat at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, Clive noticed an envelope slid halfway under his door. It was unusual. He always received his mail through the mailbox. Suspicious, he retrieved it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was typed, unsigned, and direct stop interfering. You don't know who you're dealing with. Clive's grip on the paper tightened. The calculated vagueness of the threat only served to stoke his anger. Someone clearly wanted him to back down, but that only strengthened his resolve. Instead of tossing the note aside, he photographed it and emailed it to Richard with a short message: "Add this to our evidence file." Later that day, Clive decided to do a thorough inspection of the charging station. Armed with his phone and a notebook, he documented every detail he could find. The station itself was a sleek, modern structure with multiple charging outlets, a small digital screen for payments, and even a built-in Wi-Fi signal. But what caught Clive's attention was the crude wiring that connected it to his home's electrical panel. The installation was sloppy, with exposed cables snaking across the ground and poorly secured connections. It wasn't just invasive, it was a hazard. Clive followed the cables to his home, where they had been hastily spliced into his circuit breaker. He knelt to take a closer look and froze when he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a small black box attached to the wiring, blinking with a faint green light. It was no larger than a deck of cards, but it was clearly some kind of monitoring device. Clive's mind raced. Was this how they were tracking the electricity usage? Or was it something more sinister? He took several photos before returning to the house and immediately calling Richard. "Richard, I found something," Clive said as soon as his attorney picked up. "There's a device attached to the wiring. I don't know what it is, but it looks like it's monitoring something." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Richard responded. "Don't touch it, whatever you do. If it's some kind of data logging device, we might be able to use it as evidence. I'll bring in a consultant to look at it. In the meantime, document everything." Clive spent the rest of the day on edge, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. That evening, as he sat on his couch, reviewing his notes, his phone buzzed with a call from Richard. "I've been digging into Green Grid Solutions," Richard said without preamble. "They're not just a contractor, they're part of a much larger network of companies involved in energy management and privatization. There's a history of them using aggressive tactics to expand their infrastructure. This isn't the first time they've encroached on private property." Clive's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" "We keep building our case," Richard said. "If we can prove that they installed the station illegally or that they're violating zoning laws, we can shut them down. But you need to be careful, Clive. These people play dirty." That warning proved prophetic. The next morning, Clive woke to find his property vandalized. The neatly trimmed hedge that bordered his garden had been slashed, the plants uprooted and strewn across the lawn. Someone had spray-painted the words "Community First" on the side of his shed in bold red letters. Clive stood in his yard, seething as he surveyed the damage. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to send a message. He called the police to report the vandalism, but the responding officer was dismissive. "Could have been some local kids," the officer said with a shrug, taking cursory notes. "Not much we can do without witnesses or security footage." Clive clenched his fists, but he didn't argue. As soon as the officer left, he called a security company and arranged to have cameras installed around his property. If whoever was behind this came back, Clive intended to catch them in the act. That evening, Richard called with an update. "I've obtained a copy of the permit for the charging station," he said. "There are some irregularities. For one, the permit lists the installation site as public land, but that contradicts your property records. And two, it looks like the application was expedited, probably pushed through without the usual checks. So they knew they were stepping on private property, Clive said grimly. They just didn't care. Exactly, Richard replied. This gives us something to work with. I'm filing a formal complaint with the zoning board tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest you keep a low profile. Whoever vandalized your property clearly wants to provoke you. But keeping a low profile wasn't Clive's style, especially not after the vandalism. The next day, he attended a town hall meeting where local officials were discussing the infrastructure improvement plan. Clive sat in the back, listening as council members and residents praised the new charging stations and the benefits of green energy. When the floor was open for public comments, Clive stood and addressed the room. I have a question about the charging station installed on my property, he began, his voice calm but firm. I wasn't notified about it, I didn't consent to it, and I'm being billed for the electricity. How does that align with the city's policies on private property rights? The room fell silent as the council members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them, a man named Councilman Evans, cleared his throat. Mr. Randall, thank you for your comment. The charging stations were installed as part of a broader initiative to promote green energy. Any issues with specific sites should be addressed through the appropriate channels. That's not an answer, Clive shot back. If the city is reclassifying private land as public, shouldn't property owners be informed? And what about compensation for the use of their land? Councilman Evans shifted uncomfortably. I can't speak to the specifics of your case, but I suggest you file a complaint with the zoning board. I already have, Clive said. But in the meantime, my property is being damaged, my electricity is being stolen, and I'm being harassed. This isn't just about a charging station, it's about basic property rights. There was a murmur of agreement from some of the residents in the room, but the council members quickly moved to the next topic, brushing aside Clive's concerns. As he left the meeting, Clive noticed several people watching him with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. He wasn't sure if they were allies or simply observers, but it didn't matter. He wasn't going to back down. That night, Clive reviewed the footage from his newly installed security cameras. Around 2 a.m., the motion sensors near the garden had been triggered. The grainy footage showed two figures in dark clothing moving along the edge of his property, pausing near the charging station. They didn't cause any damage this time, but their presence was enough to confirm Clive's suspicions someone was actively targeting him. With every passing day, the conflict escalated. Clive knew he was in for a long fight, but he wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was standing up against a system that thought it could steamroll over anyone who got in its way. And Clive Randall was not a man who gave up easily. The weeks that followed the town hall meeting marked a turning point in Clive Randall's battle over his land. Each day seemed to bring new complications, new obstacles, and new reasons to question just how deep the rabbit hole went. What had started as a simple dispute over an unwanted charging station was rapidly spiraling into something far more insidious. Clive had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated the sheer brazenness of the people he was up against. The morning began with a call from Richard Crane, his attorney. Clive, Richard said without preamble, I've got the initial zoning records. It's worse than I thought. Define worse, Clive said, leaning against his kitchen counter. The reclassification of your land wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. The zoning board approved the change as part of a public access expansion plan, but the approval process is riddled with irregularities. It looks like someone fast-tracked the paperwork without the required oversight. Clive pinched the bridge of his nose, his frustration mounting. So they knew it was private property and pushed it through anyway. Exactly. And here's the kicker, GreenGrid Solutions is listed as the primary contractor for the entire project. They weren't just hired to install the charging stations, they lobbied for the reclassification itself. Clive's grip tightened on the phone. So they're not just contractors, they're orchestrating the whole thing. That's what it looks like, Richard confirmed. They've done this in other cities too. Same pattern, target underused or mismanaged properties, lobby for reclassification, and install infrastructure that benefits them financially. It's a well-oiled machine. Clive let out a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves. What's our next move? We need more evidence, Richard said. Something concrete that ties GreenGrid to the irregularities in the zoning process. Without it, all we have are suspicions. I'm working on getting access to their internal communications, but that'll take time. Time, Clive thought bitterly, was the one thing he didn't have. The charging station was still draining his electricity, his garden remained a vandalized mess, and the anonymous threats had only escalated. The previous night, he'd found another note tucked into his mailbox. Last warning. Stop or face the consequences. Clive had photographed it and sent it to Richard, but the words lingered in his mind like a storm cloud. Later that afternoon, Clive decided to take matters into his own hands. Richard had advised caution, but Clive couldn't just sit and wait for the legal system to catch up. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He grabbed his phone, a flashlight, and a pair of work gloves, and headed out to the charging station. The small black box he'd discovered earlier was still attached to the wiring. Clive crouched next to it, inspecting the blinking green light. It wasn't marked with any branding, but a closer look revealed a series of numbers etched into the casing. Clive took several photos before carefully prying it loose. The device was heavier than it looked, and when he shook it gently, he could hear something rattling inside. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he had a hunch it wasn't just a simple data logger. Clive placed the box in a padded case and drove to a nearby electronics repair shop. The owner, a wiry man in his 60s named Hank, raised an eyebrow when Clive explained what he needed. "You want me to crack this open and see what's inside?" Hank asked, turning the device over in his hands. "Exactly," Clive said. "Can you do it? Depends. If it's encrypted, it might take some time. But I'll see what I can do." Clive left the shop with a mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever was inside that box could be the key to unraveling the entire operation, or it could be nothing. Either way, he knew he was taking a risk. The next day, Hank called with an update. "You were right," Hank said, his voice tinged with excitement. "This isn't just a data logger. It's a remote monitoring and control device. It's tracking electricity usage, sure, but it's also capable of rerouting power to other locations." Clive's stomach dropped. Rerouting power? To where? "I couldn't get that far," Hank admitted. "The data's encrypted, and I'd need more time to break through. But from what I can tell, this thing isn't just monitoring your grid, it's actively manipulating it." Clive's mind raced. If the charging station was rerouting power, it meant GreenGrid wasn't just exploiting his electricity, they were using it to supply other parts of the network. And if that was true, then the entire installation was a front for something much bigger. He relayed the information to Richard, who immediately saw the implications. "If we can prove this, it's game over for GreenGrid," Richard said. "No utility company or city council would back them if they're caught stealing power. But we'll need solid evidence more than just the device itself." That evening, Clive decided to investigate further. He'd noticed increased activity on a neighboring property, an empty lot that had recently been fenced off. The lot was listed as part of the infrastructure improvement plan, but Clive had his doubts. He waited until nightfall, then grabbed his flashlight and slipped through the trees that bordered his property. The lot was quiet, but Clive could see several large crates stacked near the center, along with heavy machinery. A temporary office trailer stood at the edge of the site, its windows dark. Clive crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the area with his flashlight, careful to stay out of sight. When he reached the crates, he pried one open with his pocket knife. Inside, he found rows of industrial batteries, massive units designed to store and distribute electricity. Clive stared at them, the pieces falling into place. GreenGrid wasn't just installing charging stations, they were building a private energy network, using the stolen power to charge the batteries and sell it back at a profit. Before he could investigate further, Clive heard the sound of an engine. He ducked behind the crates as a black SUV pulled into the lot. Two men stepped out, their voices low but tense. "We need to speed this up," one of them said. "Randall's getting too close. If he finds out what's going on here, it's over." Clive's pulse quickened. He crouched lower, straining to hear more, but the men moved toward the trailer, their voices fading. Clive took the opportunity to retreat, slipping back through the trees and into the safety of his property. The next morning, Clive called Richard to relay everything he had seen. "They're building a battery farm," Clive said. "They're using my electricity to power it, and they know I'm onto them." Richard's tone was grim. This changes everything. If they're operating illegally, we can get a court order to shut them down. But Clive, you need to be careful. These people aren't just playing with zoning laws, they're breaking them. And if they feel threatened, there's no telling what they'll do. Clive nodded, even though Richard couldn't see him. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Greengrid had underestimated him, and now he had the advantage. It was time to turn the tables. The following days brought a growing sense of tension to Clive Randall's quiet suburban life. The discovery of Greengrid Solutions' secret battery farm had shifted the battle into new, dangerous territory. Clive knew he was no longer dealing with simple negligence or bureaucratic incompetence. This was calculated theft on a massive scale. Every glance out his window at the charging station in his garden filled him with determination, but also unease. Greengrid's activities were growing bolder, and their threats weren't idle. It began with another unexpected letter. Unlike the vague type threats Clive had received before, this envelope was stamped with Greengrid's official logo and written in polished legalese. The letter accused Clive of trespassing on active construction sites critical to community development, and threatened legal action if he continued to interfere. It also demanded that Clive immediately cease obstruction of operations at the charging station, claiming his actions were delaying essential public infrastructure upgrades. The gall of it made Clive's blood boil. Not only had Greengrid stolen his electricity and used his land without permission, but now they had the audacity to paint themselves as the victims. Clive forwarded the letter to Richard, who called him within the hour. "This is a classic intimidation tactic," Richard said. "They're trying to rattle you and make you back off. Don't let it get to you." "I'm not rattled," Clive replied, though the tightness in his chest told a different story. "But this letter makes it clear they know I've been looking into them. They wouldn't bother with this if they weren't worried." "They're definitely worried," Richard agreed. "And for good reason. I just got word from our investigator he's found documentation showing that Greengrid bypassed multiple regulatory steps when they applied for the zoning changes. If we can link that to their battery farm operation, we'll have enough to get a court order to shut them down." Clive felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the reality of the situation. "How long will that take?" "It depends," Richard admitted. "We're moving as fast as we can, but these things don't happen overnight. In the meantime, keep your head down and don't give them any reason to escalate." But Greengrid didn't need a reason to escalate. That night, Clive woke to the sound of shattering glass. He bolted upright in bed, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight he kept on his nightstand. As he made his way downstairs, he saw the source of the noise. The window in his living room had been smashed. A brick lay on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass, and attached to it was a piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in bold. Jagged handwriting: "Final warning." "Stop." Clive's hands shook as he picked up the paper. This wasn't just intimidation, it was a direct threat. He called the police, but when the officers arrived, their response was frustratingly routine. They filed a report, advised him to install more cameras, and left without offering much reassurance. Clive knew he couldn't rely on them for protection. If he wanted to keep himself and his property safe, he would have to take matters into his own hands. The next morning, Clive hired a private security company to install motion-activated floodlights and additional cameras around his property. He also began keeping a detailed log of every incident, from the vandalism of his garden to the shattered window. He wasn't going to let Greengrid's intimidation tactics deter him. If anything, they only strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, Richard's investigation was beginning to bear fruit. He called Clive with an update that afternoon. "We found evidence that Greengrid has been routing power from your property to other sites in the area," Richard said. "This isn't just about the battery farm. They're using your electricity to support multiple operations. It's theft, plain and simple." "What do we do with that information?" Clive asked. "We use it to apply pressure," Richard replied. "If we can prove that their actions are illegal, we can force them to shut down the station and pay restitution. But we'll need to act quickly. The longer this drags out, the more damage they can do." That night, Clive decided to confront the situation head-on. He returned to the neighboring construction site under the cover of darkness, this time armed with a thermal imaging camera he had borrowed from a friend. If Greengrid was using his electricity to power their operations, The thermal camera would help him track the flow of energy. As he approached the site, Clive's suspicions were confirmed. The camera revealed a network of underground cables glowing faintly with heat, all converging on the massive industrial batteries he had discovered earlier. The batteries, in turn, were connected to additional equipment that Clive couldn't identify but suspected was part of a larger grid. He took as many photos as he could before retreating to the safety of his property. The next morning, Clive shared the images with Richard, who was both impressed and concerned. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need," Richard said. "But Clive, you're taking a big risk by going to that site. If GreenGrid catches you, they won't," Clive interrupted. "I'm careful." Even so, the tension was beginning to take its toll. Clive found himself constantly on edge, his every movement shadowed by the fear that GreenGrid might escalate their attacks. His once quiet home had become a battleground, and the stress was wearing him down. The breaking point came when Clive received his next electricity bill. It was astronomical, more than triple the usual amount. Clive stared at the numbers, his hands trembling with anger. GreenGrid wasn't just stealing his power, they were draining him financially, trying to force him into submission. But instead of breaking him, it only fueled his determination. "This ends now," Clive said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty kitchen. He called Richard and laid out a plan. "We have enough evidence to make a case, right?" Clive asked. "Yes," Richard replied cautiously, "but it's going to take time to get through the courts." "I'm not waiting for the courts," Clive said. "We're taking this public." Over the next few days, Clive began compiling all the evidence he had gathered: photos, documents, security footage, and the detailed log of incidents. With Richard's help, he prepared a formal complaint and submitted it to the zoning board, the utility commission, and the city council. But he didn't stop there. He also shared the evidence with a local watchdog group that specialized in exposing corporate corruption. The group was immediately interested in Clive's story. They promised to amplify his case and put pressure on the authorities to act. Within days, the situation began to gain traction. Clive's quiet fight against GreenGrid was turning into a public showdown, and the company was starting to feel the heat. But as the pressure mounted, so did the danger. One evening, as Clive was reviewing documents in his study, his security cameras alerted him to movement near the charging station. He switched to the live feed and saw two men in dark clothing tampering with the equipment. Clive grabbed his phone and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the men were gone, leaving behind only more damage and a new note: "You'll regret this." Clive knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't back down. GreenGrid had underestimated him, and now they were scrambling to cover their tracks. The battle was escalating, but for the first time, Clive felt like he had the upper hand. They wanted him to feel powerless, but Clive was anything but. The breaking point came on a stormy evening, just as Clive Randall was beginning to think he might be gaining ground in his battle against GreenGrid Solutions. He had spent the day coordinating with Richard and the local watchdog group, who were preparing to release a report exposing GreenGrid's illegal activities. Clive had also received word that the zoning board was finally scheduling a hearing to review his formal complaint. For the first time in weeks, he felt like the tide was turning in his favor. But GreenGrid wasn't about to let him win without a fight. As the rain lashed against his windows and lightning illuminated the sky, Clive's home security system sent an alert to his phone. Motion detected near the charging station. He quickly pulled up the live feed and froze. 3 figures in dark rain gear were huddled near the station, tools in hand. One of them was prying open the metal casing of the equipment, while another appeared to be installing something new. This wasn't simple maintenance, this was sabotage. Clive's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. He grabbed his phone and called Richard. "They're here," he said, his voice low but urgent. 3 of them right now at the station. I think they're trying to destroy evidence. "Call the police," Richard said immediately. "You need to have this documented." "I'm on it," Clive replied, hanging up and dialing the police. As he waited for the dispatcher to respond, he kept his eyes on the screen. One of the figures suddenly turned toward the camera, as if aware they were being watched. Clive's stomach tightened when the man pointed directly at the lens and said something to his companions. They didn't flee, though instead they worked faster, their movements hurried and frantic. The dispatcher finally answered, and Clive quickly explained the situation. "There's been trespassing and vandalism on my property," he said. "3 individuals are tampering with a charging station installed on my land without consent. I have them on camera." "We'll send a unit to your location," the dispatcher replied. "Stay inside and don't confront them." Clive hung up but couldn't resist glancing out the window. The figures were still there, their flashlights cutting through the rain. He felt a surge of helpless frustration. These people had invaded his life, his home, and his peace. And now they were brazenly dismantling the evidence of their crimes right in front of him. 20 minutes later, red and blue lights flashed down the street as a police cruiser pulled up. The intruders immediately scattered, vanishing into the night before the officers could reach them. The damage, however, was done. Clive stepped outside to meet the police, rain soaking through his jacket as he guided them to the charging station. The officers examined the site, their flashlights illuminating the open casing and the tangled mess of wires inside. One of them whistled softly. "They were definitely trying to mess with something," he said. "Do you know what they were doing?" "I can guess," Clive replied grimly. "They're trying to destroy evidence. This station is part of a larger illegal operation. They've been stealing electricity from my property and rerouting it to other sites." The officer raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "I do," Clive said, gesturing toward his house. "I've been documenting everything: photos, videos, logs, and I have security footage of them tonight." The officer nodded. "We'll need copies of that footage and any other evidence you have. If what you're saying checks out, this could turn into a criminal investigation." As the police worked, Clive's phone buzzed with a call from Richard. "Are they gone?" Richard asked. "They ran off when the police arrived," Clive said. "But they left the station gutted. It's a mess." "That's actually good news," Richard said. "It shows they're panicking. We'll add this to our case. In the meantime, I have another update. The Watchdog Group is releasing their report tomorrow. It's going to blow this thing wide open." The next day, Clive woke to a flurry of activity. The Watchdog Group had published a detailed expose on GreenGrid Solutions, complete with documentation of their shady zoning practices, illegal electricity rerouting, and ties to corrupt officials. The story quickly gained traction, spreading across local news outlets and social media. Reporters began calling Clive, eager for his first-hand account. Richard advised him to keep a low profile, but Clive couldn't resist making one public statement. Standing in front of the vandalized charging station, he told a local reporter, "This isn't just about me or my property. It's about standing up to corporations that think they can trample over people's rights. GreenGrid has taken advantage of this community, and it's time they're held accountable." The backlash against GreenGrid was swift. City officials, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, announced an emergency hearing to investigate the company's activities. Meanwhile, the police formally opened a criminal investigation into the sabotage attempt on Clive's property. For the first time, GreenGrid was on the defensive. But Clive wasn't celebrating yet. He knew the fight wasn't over. GreenGrid still had resources, connections, and a vested interest in protecting their operation. As he stood in his garden, staring at the wreckage of the charging station, Clive made a silent promise to himself he wouldn't rest until this was over. He had started this fight to reclaim his land, but now it was about something bigger. It was about justice. The fallout from the expose on GreenGrid Solutions was immediate and far-reaching. Public outrage spread like wildfire, fueled by revelations of the company's illegal practices and their underhanded tactics to seize private property. Clive Randall watched as the once invincible corporation was dragged into the spotlight, its executives scrambling to issue statements and shift blame. But no amount of damage control could erase the mountain of evidence against them. Within days, city officials announced the cancellation of GreenGrid's contracts and ordered an independent audit of all infrastructure projects tied to the company. The emergency hearing that followed was packed with journalists, community members, and representatives from local government. Clive attended with Richard by his side, his meticulously documented evidence ready to present. When it was Clive's turn to speak, He stood at the podium, the weight of weeks of frustration, anger and determination settling on his shoulders. He recounted everything: the unauthorized installation, the theft of electricity, the threats, and the vandalism. He described how GreenGrid had exploited bureaucratic loopholes to reclassify his land, and how they had brazenly tried to cover their tracks when he began to fight back. As he spoke, he could see the council members' expressions shift from discomfort to outrage. The hearing culminated in a unanimous decision: the charging station on Clive's property was to be immediately removed, and GreenGrid was ordered to compensate him for the damages, as well as the exorbitant utility bills he had been forced to pay. But that was just the beginning. The city referred the case to state regulators and law enforcement, ensuring that GreenGrid would face further scrutiny for its actions. A week later, Clive watched from his porch as a work crew dismantled the charging station. This time, the workers were careful and professional, supervised by a city official who offered Clive a formal apology. The moment the last piece of the station was loaded onto the truck, Clive felt a weight lift off his chest. His garden, though still scarred, was finally his again. The compensation from GreenGrid allowed Clive to repair the damage to his property and install a new, secure perimeter fence. He also invested in additional security measures, determined to prevent anything like this from happening again. But more than the physical restoration, Clive felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had stood up to a powerful corporation and won, not just for himself but for his entire community. In the months that followed, the scandal continued to unfold. Several high-ranking executives at GreenGrid resigned under pressure, and the company faced multiple lawsuits from affected property owners. Clive became something of a local hero, his story a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even skeptical now approached him with gratitude and admiration. One sunny afternoon, Clive hosted a small gathering in his garden, inviting neighbors and friends to celebrate the victory. The garden had been restored to its former beauty, with vibrant flowers blooming where the charging station had once stood. As Clive stood by the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with his guests, he felt a rare sense of peace. Later that evening, after the last guest had left, Clive sat on the porch, sipping a glass of whiskey and watching the sun dip below the horizon. The battle with GreenGrid had been long and grueling, but it had also reminded him of his own strength and determination. His land was more than just property, it was a part of him, a symbol of his independence and resolve. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Clive smiled to himself. The fight had been worth it. His home, his peace, and his pride were intact, and the world now knew that even the most powerful corporations couldn't trample over those who refused to back down.